Said earlier, we'll probably finish up later. I mean, the last panel of the day will be more questions. This is just a time to let Laurence and Margaret respond to some of the things that are current and are still in our minds, and then we'll also be able to have some other questions later on. And then, as we said earlier, if you'll put your email address on the questions, if we don't get to respond to them now, we'll try to get back to you later. So, Jack, go ahead.
Wonderful. If any of you have questions that you'd like to ask Laurence and you want to pass them up or get them to us some way, that would be... We don't have wires attached to the back of our heads, so we'll need the cards.
Just hold them up, and some of our students will get them from you.
So, Laurence, I'm sure we'll get some of those. But maybe, Margaret, would you like to comment on anything that Laurence said? That's my question to you.
The idea of the temple in the centre, I mean, that goes right back to Exodus 25, build me a holy place that I may be seen to be in your midst. And if you, I know, you know, they're not making land in city centres anymore, so it's rather expensive. But to get somewhere that's central, that's hugely important.
Wonderful. A question to both of them, I think, has to do with what kind of reception do you get for your ideas among other Christians, philosophers? How do your ideas strike people? Are you viewed as being too combative, or are people accepting what you're saying? That's a question.
Right, well, you heard why you had to come on Monday. And I spend a lot of my time going round to speak to groups of clergy in England, diocesan conferences, bishop study days, all that kind of thing. And they love it. There's one or two who are not very happy and they wriggle, but by and large, I mean, my diary is full because they love it. So that's the answer. I had a lovely compliment from a rabbi in London who said, "Thank you for giving us back our temple." And I thought, wasn't that lovely? But no, it is. I mean, it's out there. People want to know about it simply because people are recognising that this is something very important that the church has just lost touch with, and it affects every aspect of our life. You know, the shape of church buildings, the shape of liturgies, all sorts of things. My particular interest, of course, environment studies. And yeah, I'm kept very, very busy, too busy, in fact. So yes, it's very well received, Joe.
I would say that my experience as a theologian has been somewhat different to my experience as a philosopher. My philosophical work is connected with my work in temple studies, but not in ways that would be obvious to my, let's say, more secular readers. But nevertheless, a lot of my philosophical work centers around what it means to understand God and the gods in the historical philosophical tradition, because and so there I think the question is falling open over time as when I was a student, when I was an undergraduate, aggressive atheism was the mark of the day. I don't find that to be the case anymore. I think among Catholics it's more complicated because we had, many of you will be familiar with the fact that we had the Second Vatican Council, which ushered in radical change throughout the Catholic Church, and I think the Catholic Church is still digesting that change and still coming to terms with it. There is a fundamental shift, I think, among younger Catholics, younger clergy especially, to try to, there was a sense, as Catholics we tend to go overboard when we do something. We to some extent threw the baby out with the bathwater. We're now having to find the baby again. And when you explain the meanings of some of these things, there is an absolute fascination, and a lot of the initial bewilderment rather than hostility falls away for a real thirst for as it were, what we've lost. But I also interpret this as a divine gift, because, sometimes the way God reminds us, sometimes God says things to us nicely, and sometimes there's a ceremony, that in the confirmation ceremony in the Catholic Church, in the old way it was done, and the way it was done that Sunday I was in St. Louis, I was reminded, the bishop touches each person being confirmed on the cheek. It's meant to be a slap. And he's basically saying not everything that God will give you will be comfortable. And sometimes we remember things by waking up to the uncomfortable realization of what we've forgotten. And I think that's where the Catholic Church is at the present time, which has made some Catholic theologians a little grumpy. I can live with that.
I'm sure that many people do receive what you're saying with great enthusiasm and find that it has a lot of challenging, wonderful ethical and religious motivation and inspiration for them. Several of the questions, though, have asked more specific things, such as, Margaret, I know you've written a lot about Jesus Christ and Jehovah being one deity. We believe that. We get a lot of pushback for that.
I know.
Do you run into a similar thing? And Laurence, for you along the same line, we see a distinction between Aaronic priesthood and Melchizedek priesthood. Should we see these? Do other people see that distinction, or do you get pushback from people when you talk about Melchizedek priesthood and so on?
The position that I put out in my book, The Great Angel, namely that Jesus was Yahweh and recognized as such by the early Christians, this was initially received with horror. Goodness, what else will she be saying next? And then I said, well, can you find me evidence to the contrary in the first 2 centuries? And then things started to quieten down a little, which is quite interesting. I think we have lived with assumptions, and I call that laziness in biblical scholarship, for far too long. And it's only when you say, well, where do you get this from? Some of the rather more violent theories of atonement that I encounter amongst extreme evangelicals, I said, well, where is this in the Bible? And it's like dealing with journalists who tell you what the Bible says, and you say, I'm sorry, could you show me where? And they don't come back. So when you have to be 200% confident of what you're going to say before you say something, because you're dealing with people's faith and belief. But a lot of people repeat what they have been told, probably in college, and they don't ever question it. And if you go back and start, as I have to do as Protestant preacher, I would start always with the Bible. I would never preach from anything but the Bible. So we illuminate it from other things, and maybe these verses don't mean what we have always assumed they mean. I mean, I do a Good Friday service every Good Friday. It's one of the things you have to do. And I find it much more, it's not comfortable, that's the wrong word for Good Friday, but much more meaningful to do it within a temple framework. And so do the people for whom I lead the service. And I think that is the kind of the test. Because the Methodist tradition is well known for sort of grabbing preachers by the collar outside afterwards and saying, what did you mean when you said that? And you have to answer to your congregation in a big way. And the ordinary people, there's no such thing as ordinary people, but you know what I mean. The people who sit in pews on Sunday accept this, and they're very happy. And they're the consumers. And I don't actually worry too much about the academics. If my congregations are happy, who are living the faith, I can cope with the academics.
Jack's question touches on something which, there have been some references to my struggle to work out the way in which priesthood is manifesting itself in our liturgical texts. That confirmation that took place in St. Louis exactly explains it. In our older, in our unreformed ordination rites, the ordination of a deacon, a priest, or a bishop, in each case they refer to the ordaining of a Levite. But in each case a higher form of Levite. So the deacons are the Levites, the priests are the priests who are taken from the ranks of the Levites, because only a priest can be ordained from someone who's already been ordained a deacon. And it's obvious from those texts that a bishop is a high priest. That bringing the vestments down from the altar is the transformation of a Levitical priest into a Melchizedek priest for the purpose of an ordinance, because the Melchizedek priesthood is an eternal priesthood and fundamentally the priesthood of Christ, which as it were a bishop or a priest or even a deacon holds in a certain way, but only exercises for certain functions. Now that's my understanding of it. I could go into a lot more detail, but that, I think, I know of no other Catholic theologian who understands it in that way. And yet when I explain it, I get immediate recognition. And one of my closest friends is now a very, very senior figure in the hierarchy, and I sent him a paper, because I was a bit worried. I thought, maybe I'm going to get kind of really wrapped on the knuckles for saying this stuff. And he wrote back to me and said, we've been using your paper on the Melchizedek priesthood, where I talked actually in this paper about the way we make the holy oil. So we don't make them like that anymore. I wish we did. But the old ceremonies of the making of the oils were quite startling and clearly very ancient. I won't. He said, we've been using this paper in order to, because I've been leading in my group in my congregation. He's an official. We've been trying to understand priesthood. And I was hugely relieved. But we talked privately, and he said, I think you're absolutely right. And the reason he said that, he's the editor of many liturgical texts, and he knows them inside out. He knows that these words are there. That this is the authentic way to interpret those texts. So I don't get pushback. Actually, what I get is the sort of people who don't want to hear what is said, a bewildered silence. But in key places, I get recognition. So I think I don't think I'm doing anything which is contrary to my own tradition. And I've certainly not been told to shut up yet.
Gary, do we have time for any more questions? Or
just one question, and I'll make sure.
One question. This will take at least half an hour to answer.
So I'm going to go out and make sure that the presenters.
And let me say that many of the questions are very specific and can be answered with a quick email saying, if you will read this chapter or that chapter in something that Margaret has written, you'll have the information you're looking for. We'll send some of those to you. But there are several questions, Margaret, especially to you, but Laurence, you may want to comment on this as well, that deal with the use of terminology, titles especially, that you seem to be using in a different way than they're usually used. For example, the word Adam. Is Adam a person, or is it a title, or both? And how does Adam relate to angels? You use the word angel to refer to not just what we would think of. You've written a whole book on angels, but
yes.
And the great angel. But how is the word angel to be understood? The word resurrection is taking on a different range of meanings in what you've said than what we usually think of. The word wisdom, not just being wise in a proverbial sense, but wisdom as a female deity, counsel, and so on.
Yeah.
I want to just talk generally, not about each of these, but how do we know when a word is being used as a title in some kind of nominalist way, and when it's being used more in what we might say the more ordinary sense of the word?
I think the answer to that is by trial and error. If you start off by thinking or looking and saying, I wonder if, in the places where I find Adam in the Hebrew Scriptures, and that's not just in Genesis, if it makes more sense to substitute the idea of an individual, or if it's just representative of humanity, something like that. And when you do this with words, I've done it with Adam, I've done it with various forms of Zadok and Zadik, there's this word righteous one, things like that. If you try that in the text, and suddenly the text, it's as though you switched a light on, then I think to myself that possibly this was more likely to be the way it was originally intended. So I do it simply by trial and error, putting different English, doing different English translations of various Hebrew bits, saying, does this actually make more sense if you put it like this? The same when I do my repointing exercises, because of course the ancient texts were not pointed, this is putting vowels in them. Does it make more sense if you put these vowels or these vowels? And sometimes you can, you get gobbledygook, and sometimes a light comes on and you say, oh my goodness, I can see why those were changed. So it's literally trial and error and collecting things that seem to work. And very often they do. And then sometimes you'll find, an odd targum or something like that came to the same conclusion. That's very reassuring. But I don't actually start from that. I actually experiment with the text and the ancient versions.
And sometimes it can be both, can't it?
Oh, sometimes I would say it can be both, because this wordplay, this is something that I wish I was better at. But there are many, many places in the Hebrew text where you can read it with its customary pointing, its Masoretic pointing, and then you can look at it again and say, well, what would happen if I put different vowels around that? Those same words differently emphasised, something like that. Words that sound very similar, and you get a different meaning. Now, we know they did this because Isaiah, in Isaiah's parable of the vineyard, it actually breaks the surface. So we know he did this wordplay. And you go to other passages in the same prophet, and that's how you kind of, learn how to do it. And then you can look in other Old Testament texts and say, well, there's two meanings here. And, the good meaning and the bad meaning. Now, this is a long job, and it's a process of trial and error, and there's a lot of trial in it, and there's a lot of error. But eventually, interesting things emerge. And then when you discover the same wordplay popping up but translated into Greek, so the wordplay is lost, in the book of Revelation, I consider I've made a hit. And so I put that down as one that's likely to be the case.
Very good.
So that's how it works.
Yeah. And I guess that's, with the trial and error and repetition, that's why you have to keep going back to the temple. Right?
You always have to keep back over everything.
And as I think you've both said, with symbolism and with the domain of the temple, we have richness and double meanings in lots of places. So, well...
Jack, could you explain how I got those awful Hebrew...
Oh, yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Our fault on this, for the Hebrew problems here, Margaret didn't email these to us in a PDF, so the text was still floating around a little bit in Word. And Word doesn't know whether it should be forward or backward, and sometimes the letters got scrambled.
Yeah.
So it was not Margaret's fault.